The man who had redrawn the map of Europe believed he was an instrument of destiny, that his will and the will of history were one and the same. And then came the rain-soaked fields of Waterloo. The defeat was not just a military loss, it was a rupture in reality, a day when destiny itself seemed to break. In the immediate aftermath, as the remnants of his imperial guard staggered back towards Paris, shock waves of disbelief spread across the continent. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a far more personal devastation. He had not just lost a battle, he had lost his aura of invincibility. The god of war had been revealed to be a mortal man. Returning to Paris, he found a city not of defiance, but of political maneuvering. The last desperate gambits for power were already in play. He still had loyal generals and the remnants of an army, but the will of the politicians, the financiers, the men who truly ran the capital, had turned against him. They no longer saw him as France's savior, but as an obstacle to its survival. They feared another bloody, drawn-out war on French soil. The calls for his abdication grew from a whisper to a roar. For a man who had seized power in a coup and held it for 15 years through sheer force of will, this was the ultimate humiliation. To be undone not by enemy cannons, but by his own government. The historical records of these final days in Paris paint a picture of a man in a daze, vacillating between flashes of his old defiant energy and a weary, fatalistic acceptance. He signed away his empire for the second and final time, not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. His conquerors, the British, Prussians, Austrians, and Russians, faced a new problem. What do you do with a living legend? To execute him would be to create a martyr, a symbol that could inspire revolution for generations. To imprison him in Europe was too risky. He was too close, his followers too numerous. They needed a cage, but it had to be the right kind of cage. They chose the small Mediterranean island of Elba. On paper, it was a masterstroke. It was a picturesque prison, close enough for surveillance, but far enough to neutralize his immediate threat. The journey to Elba was a strange one. As he traveled through France, he was met with sullen crowds and even royalist mobs who threatened his life. But upon boarding the British ship HMS Undaunted, he was treated not as a prisoner, but with the deference due to a fallen monarch. It was the beginning of a bizarre new reality. Elba was a golden cage. He was granted sovereignty over the tiny island, allowed to keep his title of emperor, and given a small personal guard of a few hundred veteran soldiers. For a man who had commanded armies of 500,000, it was a toy kingdom. But Napoleon, constitutionally incapable of idleness, threw himself into his new role with a manic energy. His retirement was anything but. The historical account from the island are almost comical. He immediately began grand designs for his new empire. He reorganized the island's iron mines, designed new roads and bridges, reformed its agriculture, and modernized its sanitation. He held court, hosted lavish balls, and drilled his miniature army with the same seriousness he had shown at Austerlitz. He was playing emperor on a stage the size of a postage stamp. But beneath the surface of this frantic activity, the tension was palpable. The island was swarming with spies from every major European power, their reports meticulously detailing his every move. His British commissioner, Sir Neil Campbell, watched him constantly. Was this truly a retired exile, content to rule his tiny kingdom? Or was this a strategic waiting game, a tiger pacing in its cage, watching, waiting for the bars to weaken? Napoleon himself gave a hint, telling Campbell with a wry smile, "My island is very small."
The bars of the cage were weaker than anyone imagined. While Napoleon played emperor on Elba, the restored Bourbon monarchy in France, under King Louis XVIII, was proving disastrously unpopular. The new king was seen as an arrogant relic, a puppet of foreign powers. The soldiers of the Grande Armée were dismissed, their pensions cut, their pride wounded. The tricolor flag of the revolution was replaced by the white fleur-de-lis of the monarchy. France, which had tasted glory under Napoleon, now tasted humiliation. From his island prison, Napoleon heard the news. He saw his moment. The waiting game was over. In February 1815, under the cover of darkness, Napoleon slipped past his British guards and set sail from Elba with his tiny army of 1,000 men. The escape was an act of breathtaking audacity. When the news hit the capitals of Europe, it was met first with disbelief, then with sheer terror. The monster was loose again. His march to Paris is one of the most extraordinary episodes in military history. An empire regathered without a single shot fired. The French army, sent by the king to arrest him, instead defected to his side. When Marshal Ney, one of his most famous commanders who had promised the king to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, met his old emperor on the road, he and his entire army famously wept and joined his cause. The Bourbons fled, and Napoleon entered Paris in triumph. The 100 Days had begun. This triumphant return, this defiance of all odds, would be his final, glorious roar. But it was a gamble built on overconfidence. He believed he could split the Allied powers diplomatically and defeat them militarily in a lightning campaign. He was wrong. The powers of Europe, having been burned once, were united in their determination to destroy him for good. The final gamble at Waterloo was the ultimate consequence of his belief in his own destiny. This time, there would be no golden cage. There would be no title, no toy army, no chance of escape. This time, they would send him to the end of the earth. His new prison was St. Helena, a remote, windswept volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from any continent. It was the most isolated, unforgiving place they could find. The treacherous journey itself was a form of punishment, weeks on a storm-tossed sea. When he arrived, he found not a villa, but a damp, rat-infested, and dreary house called Longwood. This was to be his final confinement. His daily life, meticulously recorded by the small retinue of loyal followers who had accompanied him, became a slow-motion study in humiliation. He was no longer emperor, but General Bonaparte. His mail was read, his movements were restricted, and his luxuries dwindled. The British Guard was a constant, suffocating presence. The central drama of his St. Helena exile was the battle of wills with the new governor, Sir Hudson Lowe. Lowe was a rigid, humorless, and insecure bureaucrat, a man utterly terrified of his famous prisoner and obsessed with the minutiae of security. He saw plots in every shadow, escape plans in every friendly conversation. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of a titan's spirit. The man who had dictated terms to emperors and kings was now reduced to squabbling over the quality of his wine. For Napoleon, a man who lived on action and glory, this forced idleness, this daily diet of petty humiliations was a torture more profound than any physical chain.
Trapped on his rock, stripped of his power, Napoleon began the last and perhaps most important campaign of his life, the battle for his own legacy. He could no longer command armies, so he commanded words. He spent his days dictating his memoirs to his companions. The accounts they produced, most famously the Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène by the Comte de Las Casas, were not meant to be objective history. They were masterpieces of political propaganda designed to shape his image for posterity. In this final dictated narrative, the Napoleon of St. Helena performed a remarkable transformation. The ambitious dictator became a misunderstood visionary. The warmonger became a man who had only ever sought a lasting peace for united Europe. His invasions were reframed as defensive actions, his authoritarian rule as a necessary step to save the French Revolution from its own excesses. He presented himself as a son of the revolution, a champion of the common man, a martyr sacrificed by the petty reactionary monarchs of the old world. The historical record, of course, is far more complex, filled with evidence of his ruthless ambition and lust for power. But Napoleon knew that the first story told is often the one that endures. From his island prison, he was forging the Napoleonic legend, a myth so powerful, it would captivate the world for the next 2 centuries. Even in defeat and exile, his influence continued to ripple across Europe. The legal and administrative reforms he had imposed on the lands he conquered, the Napoleonic Code, remained in place, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. His campaigns, by shattering old feudal structures and inadvertently sparking national consciousness in places like Germany and Italy, helped fuel the very forces of nationalism that would define the 19th century. He had lost the war, but the world he left behind was irrevocably his. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. The official cause of death was stomach cancer. But a mystery has always surrounded his final moments. His last word, whispered in a feverish delirium, was reportedly "Army, Army." Even at the end, his mind was on the battlefield. But later analysis of his preserved hair samples revealed high levels of arsenic, leading to persistent theories that he was slowly poisoned by his British captors, or perhaps accidentally by his own household's use of arsenic-laced wallpaper in the damp conditions of Longwood. Was he a victim of murder, a casualty of his environment, or simply a man succumbing to disease? The controversy adds one final, dramatic chapter to his story. The enduring fascination with Napoleon lies in this very ambiguity. He was a tyrant and a reformer, a destroyer and a creator, a genius and a gambler who pushed his luck one time too many. His exile was not just a postscript to his career, it was the crucible in which his ultimate legacy was forged. Stripped of everything else, he was left with only his own story, and he wielded it with the same strategic brilliance he had once used to command his armies. The final battle was for memory itself, and by a great many measures, it was a battle that Napoleon, the prisoner of St. Helena, ultimately won.